There was a fortune to be made in smuggling slaves across the Atlantic. In the Bight of Biafra, selling people was always more profitable than selling palm oil, and the plantation owners of Cuba and Brazil were always eager to buy. Between 1831 and 1840, more than 200,000 people were transported to Cuba and more than 400,000 to Brazil. Standing in the way of this trade was the West Africa Squadron. On March the 4th, 1840, it got a new commanding officer, Joseph Denman, and he was determined to stop it. Denman was born on the 23rd of June 1810 and joined the Navy as a midshipman at just 13. He passed his exams and was commissioned as a lieutenant at 21, rising to the rank of commander by 25. By 30, he was in command of a squadron. His father had been a Member of Parliament, the Attorney General, and Lord Chief Justice. He was also a passionate abolitionist who felt that slavers should be treated like pirates. His son shared his views, but it was an incident whilst he was a lieutenant that would set him on a path that tested the very limits of international law. In 1815, Britain was able to pressure Portugal into declaring the slave trade illegal. However, the Portuguese were only willing to do this for the Northern Hemisphere, as their Brazilian colony was completely reliant on slave labour. The Portuguese had never intended to enforce this ban, but in 1817, the British were able to pressure them into allowing the Royal Navy to enforce it for them. Denman was operating under these treaties in 1834 when he captured a Portuguese slaver headed for Brazil. He took his prize to be condemned at the Court of Mixed Commission at Rio, only for them to refuse because the ship was not Brazilian. The court told him he must take his prize to the court at Sierra Leone, all the way across the other side of the Atlantic. So he headed back across the Atlantic, but at Sierra Leone he ran into the loophole in the treaties that I've already mentioned. The ship had been captured south of the equator. This meant that despite being caught stuffed full of slaves, it had to be set loose. Many of the 500 people on board died in the dark, stinking holds of that ship on its 2 trips across the Atlantic, and the survivors were now going to be sent into slavery anyway. This loophole was removed by revisions to the treaties in 1839, but that would not save any of those people. Denman never forgot them, and was determined to do everything in his power to stop anybody else sharing their fate. However, there was still the problem of finding the smugglers, who would be warned about the squadron's movements. They had 4,000 miles of coastline to patrol, and if they just patrolled random areas, it'd be like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Like everybody else, he knew that there were certain areas which were open to the trade, and some that were not. If somebody had turned up at Cetra Crew trying to buy people, then they would not receive a warm welcome. But if they were into the Galinas Delta, there would be just one vessel amongst many. So Denman decided to go there and simply wait outside until they came to him. For months he had his ships sailing close to that part of the coast to bottle up the slavers inside. This probably prevented 13,000 people from being taken to the Americas. But as the Galinas was a sovereign kingdom, he could not go into the river itself. If he was to go beyond blockading the port, Denman needed some kind of an excuse, and then one of the most powerful men in the region decided to give him one. Prince Mana kidnapped a Sierra Leone lady called Fry Norman, along with her child, and made them his slaves. The governor of the Sierra Leone colony ordered Denman to free Fry Norman, by force if necessary. Just as an aside, she never used his royal title, because disrespecting him was her one way of showing that he couldn't scare her. But he was a man you should be scared of. The prince was King Siaka's commander-in-chief in the conflict that had racked the Gallinas since 1818, and he was a dangerous man. He eventually defeated his rival by tricking him into opening the gates of his fortress. They caught him, tied him up, and they cut his throat. When his mother came out to try and find her son, Prince Mana cut her throat as well. Her body was then mutilated and her son's head forced into the bloody remains of her bowels. The slave traders traded with people on both sides of this conflict and operated with the consent of their African hosts. Some even married into the families of the local elites, and they owned many of the labyrinth of islands that made up the Galinas. Some of these islands had lookout posts which could be up to 100 feet tall. These were manned by sentries who scanned the horizon for approaching ships. This maze extended for about a mile before you reached a set of islands occupied by the slave traders themselves. These men furnished their mansions with every luxury that could be purchased in Europe and the Indies. The most notorious of them was a man called Pedro Blanco. He had grown so rich that he owned a fleet of fast clippers and had an entire island devoted to his harem, plus others that he used as prisons. Denman himself was almost captured while scouting this maze in a canoe that he had borrowed from one of his West African sailors. His orders were to free Mrs. Norman, but his plan went far beyond that. His opening move was to contact the king and organize a meeting. The king himself did not come, but he did send a man to negotiate along with Prince Manor. The prince eventually agreed to release Mrs. Norman. This could have been the end of his mission, but Denman wasn't close to finished. He brought up that some of his sailors had almost drowned, and the threats that the slave traders said from the slave traders which had stopped anybody else coming to their aid. The king's representative apologized and explained that the king's infirmity and the civil war, which was still going on, meant that they had become a law unto themselves. So Denman decided to offer him a solution to his problem. Commander Denman would have known that he was operating in the very limits of his authority as he negotiated a treaty with King Siaka to ban the slave trade within the king's territory, using the traders' own goods as a sweetener. Neither man expected this treaty to last for long, and it didn't, but he had learned from his experience as a lieutenant that he needed legal cover for what he was going to do next. Denman's 3 ships formed a landing party of sailors and marines. They headed up the river in small boats and managed to slip past the watchtowers. There were 8 slave trading posts in the area. After he had finished, there were none. He burned them to the ground and personally fired a rocket into one of them to set it ablaze. About 900 enslaved people were freed and taken back to Sierra Leone, where they could start new lives. The Spanish slave traders were also offered passage to protect them from what the locals might do next, an act of charity that he would later come to regret. Their goods, however, were left for the king and Prince Manor to do with as they pleased. Denman had gone far beyond his original orders, but as burning down those 8 factories was the most severe blow struck to the slave trade to this point, he was quite happy with his actions. Lord Russell, the colonial secretary, and Lord Palmerston, the foreign secretary, agreed. Palmerston was said to have exclaimed, "Taking a wasp's nest is more effective than catching wasps one by one." On his return to Britain, he was given the job of drawing up new instructions for the Royal Navy, as Palmerston wanted similar operations to take place on other parts of the coast. His officers and men were granted £4,000 in prize money for the people that they had freed, although it would be years before they got it because of what else was going on. Denman was not the only one exploring the consequences of this attack. In August of 1841, Thomas Buron was in Havana gathering testimony for proceedings against Denman. Buron was only a small time trader, but he was acting as an agent for Blanco. When the case came to court, the 3 plaintiffs demanded £370,000 in compensation from Denman for the damage that he had done. This is a staggering sum of money. It would have brought you an entire fleet of warships, and a better one than Denman had commanded. It was almost as much as the bribe that Britain had been forced to pay Blanco's home country of Spain to get them to ban the slave trade. It was more than the one that they had paid Portugal. If they had been hoping to scare Denman through the sheer scale of their demands, then they had badly misjudged the kind of man that they were up against. The writs were issued in August of 1842, but it wasn't until February of 1848 that they actually came to court due to the difficulty of assembling witnesses from Spain, Cuba, Sierra Leone and other far-flung places. During this gap, the simple existence of the trial had emboldened slave traders along the African coast and caused a great strain to diplomatic relations between Great Britain and Spain. The slave traders argued that they had been operating in a territory where everybody agreed that it was legal to sell people. Denman's defense responded that his actions had been approved by the Admiralty and the Queen in the war against slavery. As Denman was a naval officer, his actions therefore could not be in a breach of law and could not be brought against him in an English court. The jury found in his favour. Denman would have been happier if the court had decided that slave trading was illegal under international law, but at least now his career could continue. He joined Prince Albert's retinue, and the two even went shooting together. Then he became groom-in-waiting to Queen Victoria herself. He had an unsuccessful attempt to get elected to Parliament before going to sea again. This was in command of the Royal Yacht. Queen Victoria was sad to see him go when he was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1862. Then in 1864, he relieved Vice Admiral John King and became Commander-in-Chief in the Pacific, where he served until 1866. The war within the Galinas had finally ended in 1852, when Prince Manor invited everybody to peace negotiations on his territory, and had them all murdered. His final fall from power was not until 1858. He had cooked up a scheme to resume slave trading under the protection of the French Emperor, but he was driven from the territory by another chief who opposed it. All the sources for this little talk are on our website, and if you liked it, then please give it a like, and that will get the algorithm to show it to more people. Next time I'm going to talk about one of the places that the people taken from the Galinas would have been going to, and the lengths that Britain went to stop them from importing any more enslaved people.